second week of September, we're going to do something that we've never done before. The event will be called The Second Life of Bent's Old Fort. So we're going to have a reenactment that is based on the stagecoach era of Bent's Fort. And we're mostly focused on the fur trade. But it went out of business as a trading fort in 1849 and had a whole second life in the 1860s that we usually don't talk about. So we're gonna do an event about that. So that's very exciting. And then finally, late in the year, we have the candlelight evening tours. And we're going to be doing that this year and hopefully again next December as well. We had to skip it because of COVID last year, so we're bringing it back on the evenings of December 2nd and December 3rd. We'll have historians in many of the rooms and guided tours going through so you can see it at night when it's all lit up, and it's a beautiful couple of evenings. So you're certainly welcome to participate in that. Something we're doing a little bit different this year with that holiday event, we are going to be selling tickets online through recreation.gov a month in advance, so you can get your tickets on the computer. And then finally, coming up just around the corner on Veterans Day, we're going to be doing a military timeline. So we're going to have historians that are going to be demonstrating the uniforms of some of the different military units that have served in this area in the past. So that should be an exciting event as well. So you're welcome to come out for any or all of these events. We'd love to see you out there at Bent's Fort. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into my talk for the evening, War and Calamity. And I'm going to start out by giving you a description of what life was like at Bent's Fort, who the people were out there, what they were doing out there, and then talk about in detail the years of 1846 and 47, which are the years of the Mexican-American War, because that's when the community that had been established at Bent's Fort comes apart and comes to its end, and those years lead to the eventual abandonment of the fort. But as the lives of the people at the fort change, the lives of everyone in the region are changed, and it permanently, the events there permanently change the lives of the people of Mexico, of the United States, and of the nations of the Great Plains. So it's actually a really critical time in history, not just locally, but with international impact. So it's interesting to understand all the things that happen. So, Bent's Fort is a replica of a trading post that was built just a few miles from here, outside of La Junta on the Arkansas River back in 1833. It was in business through 1849. And when you hear the word fort, people often think of the Army. They think it's a military installation. But in this case, this is a trading fort. So rather than an army post, it's a privately owned business. It belonged to William and Charles Bent and their business partner, Saron St. Vrain. Now they built their trading fort in a very carefully chosen location that was recommended to them by friends that they had among the Cheyenne people. So it's right in the bend of the Arkansas River. And at that time, the river was the international border between the United States and Mexico. The fort is also built right next to the Santa Fe Trail. It's on the mountain branch of the trail. And the owners of the fort were merchants who were engaged in the fur trade. So they were bringing in trade goods from all over the world. And we've got some examples that are here. There's some that were brought in advance. We have a display here in this case, and I brought some additional things here as well, and a buffalo robe. So you're welcome to touch these things. But they're bringing in trade goods from all over the world to exchange for furs. Now, the 1830s is the tail end of the beaver trade, and beaver fur is one of the things that settled the West. People are coming out to trap those animals so they can market those valuable furs. But by the early 1830s, fashions were changing. The furs were originally in demand because they felted them to make gentlemen's top hats, but then styles changed, and the new great thing was silk top hats. So nobody wanted beaver furs anymore. So the next great thing in the fur trade was buffalo robes. And there's, got this one here. This is a nice big robe. Robes were shipped back east by the thousands, and they're being used for coats, for carriage robes. The leather is being used for belt work and machinery. So Bent St. Vrain and Company is trading goods that they brought in on the Santa Fe Trail with the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho people to get the buffalo robes that they have harvested. And the busiest time of year at the fort is the winter, when active trading is going on. And you'll have Americans and Spaniards and Frenchmen in there speaking their different languages, but also the people of the Great Plains, Cheyenne, Arapaho. You may also have Comanche, Kiowa, Plains Apache coming to trade at the fort. So it's this incredible blend of people and cultures. There are Mexican laborers that work at the fort. Many of the clerks and traders that work there have Mexican or native wives, or the traders there have Mexican or native wives, so they're a big part of the culture of the fort as well. And on top of all that, this is before the American Civil War, so there were slaves that lived at the fort. Some of the ones that are remembered best are Charlotte, Dick, and Andrew, and I'll talk about them a little bit more. So through the 1830s and the early 1840s, they're engaged in the fur trade. They're bringing goods down the Santa Fe Trail. Things are going well. But then in the mid-1840s, everything changes with the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. Now, to understand the war, we have to go backwards a little bit in history. So we'll go back to 1821. 1821 was the year that Mexico won its independence from Spain. After years of war, they finally broke free of colonial rule. Now, in the United States, we fought our war of independence, starting back with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. We were free of colonial rule by 1884. So Mexico was under colonial rule for another 37 years after we had become an independent nation. And this had a huge impact on them. The Spanish Empire did not allow Mexico to trade directly with the United States, their neighbors to the north. They wanted all business and commerce to flow back to Spain. So in Mexico, they couldn't trade, they couldn't develop any industry. All goods came in by sea and came north from Mexico City. And there's a lot of trade goods coming in, but as you go further and further north, the trade goods just go down to a trickle. So it's very difficult to get anything through trade in the northern provinces of New Spain. But then after they break free from colonial rule in 1821, now they're looking for opportunities for business and commerce. In the meanwhile, in Missouri in 1821, Missouri is recovering from the panic of 1819, what today we would call a depression or a recession, and they had just become a state. So the people there are also looking for opportunities for business and growth. And so when these two groups meet, the Santa Fe Trail begins. And you've got commerce traveling in both directions. Merchants coming up out of Mexico, merchants from Missouri going down the trail, and they're bringing in goods from all over the world. And the trade grows year by year, and it becomes increasingly valuable. Now, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, at that time, the United States is still a fairly young nation. Mexico is a brand new nation. The colonial powers of Europe are still very influential in the New World, especially Spain, France, and Great Britain. And so whoever can get the land and control it is gonna compete and do that any way that they can. Land is frequently changing hands. The area where Bent Fort is, if you're on the north side of the Arkansas River, that became part of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase, the American Revolution, that all happened in the lives of the people that lived at Bent's Fort, or maybe their parents' generation. So it's all still very new and very much at play. So this era is the time of manifest destiny. You guys remember that phrase? You hear it maybe back in school, way back when. So manifest destiny is the idea that the United States was destined to become a nation from coast to coast. But in the 1830s and 40s, you're not nearly there yet. The nation is still mostly on the East Coast. The edge of the United States is in Missouri. But as the trade on the Santa Fe Trail develops and becomes increasingly valuable, the people in Washington are saying, we want that. And so offers are made to buy California and New Mexico from Mexico. But Mexico's like, no, not for sale. We're not giving that up. And so for now, the United States can't do anything about it. They don't have a willing buyer, but they want to grow. They want to be a nation from coast to coast. And then Texas comes along. Now, Texas starts out as a northern province of Mexico. And when Mexico gets its independence from Spain, they invite Americans to come in and settle in Texas, thinking that these Americans will become Mexican citizens and grow and develop towns, businesses, farms, ranches that will be of benefit to Mexico. But the problem comes in when the people of Texas, the American settlers there, they don't want to follow the rules and laws imposed on them by the Mexican government. And instead, in 1835 and 36, they break away, fight the Texas Revolution, and become the independent Republic of Texas. Then 9 years later, in 1845, they become the 28th state. Now, if you're the United States, this is great. If you're Mexico, not so good, right? You've been a nation for just a short time, and now suddenly a large part of your northern territory has joined your neighbor to the north. So it's pretty rough. Now, there are disputes about where the borders of Texas should be. The United States says the border is definitely the Rio Grande. Mexico says the border is definitely the Rio Nueces. Have you guys ever heard of the Rio Nueces? There's a reason for that. So, the Rio Grande is here. The Rio Nueces is the next waterway to the north. And there's a dispute here about where the border is going to be. And President John Tyler sends American troops into that disputed area. Now, if you're Mexico and you think the border is here, as far as you're concerned, the Americans have just invaded your nation. If you're the United States and you say the border is here and you've got troops here and the Mexicans fire upon them, you're defending your country and now they've committed an act of war. That's how the Mexican-American War begins, over that border dispute. And it lasts for about 2 years. The United States forces the surrender of Mexico and ends up with half of Mexico becoming the American Southwest. So now let's go back to Bent's Fort and what this has to do with Bent's Fort and how these events played out there. Now, in the summer of 1846, a few months after the war was declared with Mexico, General Stephen Watts Kearny and the Army of the West, a force of over 1,600 men, came down the Santa Fe Trail from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and they broke out into small caravans, and then they regrouped when they got to the area of Bent's Fort, and they encamped nearby, and then they continued down into Santa Fe and took the capital and captured New Mexico. Now, as they came through, there was all kinds of, chaos and hubbub. You've got hundreds of soldiers in the area. Most of them continued on their way down into New Mexico. They arrived in late July and were gone by the middle of August. But there were a group of about 60 soldiers that were too ill to travel that got left behind at the fort. There were quite a few vehicles that were in need of repair. They had to actually bring in extra blacksmiths from over in what's now Pueblo, Colorado. Pueblo was there by that time, and so they brought in extra blacksmiths from there to help take care of the needs of the army. And when they go down into New Mexico, William Bent and a party of 6 other men in his employ are asked to precede the army into New Mexico and provide them with information. So they form what's known as the Company of Spies. And they lead the way down into New Mexico. Now, when General Kearny goes down there, he's expecting to meet resistance. But what ends up happening is the last Mexican governor of New Mexico, Manuel Armijo, ends up surrendering New Mexico without a fight. And General Kearny just goes all the way into Santa Fe. Now again, if you're the Americans, you're the Mexicans, or excuse me, you're the Americans, and you've just walked in and conquered Santa Fe, New Mexico without a battle, this is great, right? What if you're a citizen of New Mexico, There hasn't been even a fight, and now suddenly you're an American, and you have no say in whether you wanted to be one or not. Now, for the people in New Mexico, they had heard a lot of awful things. How their religion was going to be abolished and their women were going to be violated. So there was a lot of fear. But the Americans came in, they said, okay, we're your friends, we're here to protect you, we're here to help you, as long as you don't resist, life will be good. But it doesn't play out so well. When they get down there, much of General Kearny's force are volunteers out of Missouri. And these are young men, far from home, and a lot of them behave very poorly. And they're very rough on the locals and behave in inappropriate ways. Another thing that happens is the soldiers inadvertently bring measles with them. And the measles spreads to the people of Santa Fe, and children are dying of sickness that have been brought in by the soldiers. So these things do not make the Americans popular. Now, General Kearny, in a few months, continues on to California to participate in the war there. But before he leaves, he establishes a territorial government. And in charge of this government, he appoints the first governor of New Mexico. The name may be familiar to you. Charles Bent, one of the owners of Bent's Old Fort, is made the first governor of New Mexico. But for the people of Mexico, this isn't such a great choice. The Americans think this is great. He's a good guy, he knows the land, he knows the people, he's the perfect candidate. But he's been doing business there for years, and so they know him. But all the time he was doing business in New Mexico, he never became a Mexican citizen. He has a Mexican wife and children, but he never married her in the faith. He never becomes a Catholic. Yet in spite of that, he's been awarded with large land grants. Now he's the governor. He's not popular. And a few months later, in January of 1847, there's an uprising, today known as the Taos Revolt. And Charles Bent travels home to visit his family in Taos. He goes from Santa Fe back to Taos. And shortly after he arrives, his home is attacked and he is brutally murdered in front of his family. Several other American officials are murdered as well. The next day, a place nearby called Turley's Mill, the Americans there are attacked and killed. So a day or two later, word of this uprising gets back to Santa Fe. Now by this time, General Kearny is left, but the guy in charge after he departs is a guy named Colonel Sterling Price. So Price, with his soldiers, heads up to Taos. And at that same time in Santa Fe, one of Charles's friends and partners, Saran St. Vrain, is there. And he gathers a force of Americans that become known as the Avengers. And he rides with Price up to Taos. And they fight a couple of engagements on their way there to battling the people that are in rebellion. When they finally get to Taos, they trap the rebels that they find there inside a church. They blow a hole in the side of the church, kill most of the people inside it. The few people that try to escape, most of them are captured and killed as well. There are a few people, let's see, it's around 23 men that they bring to trial a few months later in April. The judge, the jury, everybody involved, they're all friends and family of Charles Bent and or other people that were killed in the uprising. So to call this justice, some people say, maybe not so much. But they did go through the effort of holding a trial, and 19 out of the 23 individuals who were tried were executed for murder and treason. So, the Taos Revolt has a devastating effect on the people of Bent's Fort. The word of Charles's murder is brought to William Bent, who at the time is camped out at Big Timbers, which is about 40 miles down the river, and he's camped out there with his Cheyenne friends and relatives. And the Cheyenne people are so upset because by this time they consider the Bent's family. William Bent has a Cheyenne wife and children. They've been business partners. They've been family for many years at this point. The Cheyenne are so upset that they offer to go down into Taos and scalp everybody there. And William Bent has the presence of mind to say, no, let the American soldiers handle it. So you imagine if he had not made that choice, it could have been a lot of death and chaos that ensued, even worse than what happened. So the Mexican-American Wars that had a major impact on the people of Bent's Fort. It was all over by January of 1848. The surrender of the Mexican government happened in September, and then a few months later in January, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. And following the end of the war, what takes place is called the Mexican Cession. So there's around, if I remember the number right, 525,000 square miles of northern Mexico becomes the American Southwest. All the states that we know there today. So for the United States, it's the third largest land acquisition in American history. So it's a huge event. And exciting for the United States, but of course, devastating for Mexico. Now, after the Taos Revolt and the end of the war, the trade relationships that the people at Bent's Fort had established with the merchants in Mexico, in Taos and Santa Fe, even as far away as Mexico City, you can imagine those relationships are now in tatters. At the fort itself, they had a large number of Mexican workers who did things like build the original fort, maintain the adobe, did cooking and cleaning, manual labor like herding livestock and cutting firewood. Now suddenly, after the Taos Revolt, they don't want to work for the Bents anymore. They have their feelings towards the Bent family have changed dramatically. And so the Mexican laborers are thought to have started leaving. And there are first-hand accounts of people that were at the fort in 1846 and 1847 who said the fort begins to be in a state of disrepair, it's very dirty, things are not going well there because all the relationships that they had nurtured for years are coming undone. Now, other things that happened in 1847, just to add insult to injury, are even harder. Charles dies in January. The trials happen in April. The two slaves that I mentioned, there's three slaves. Charlotte, her husband Dick, and Andrew, who was possibly Dick's brother, we don't know for sure. They depart the fort in May of 1847 after being part of the community there for years. When Colonel Price came north out of Santa Fe to put down the rebellion in Taos, Dick went with them and participated in the fighting and received a major injury. And as an act of gratitude for his rising up to revenge the family, he and his wife were given their freedom. So the last we know of them in the historical record, they were headed east on the Santa Fe Trail with the spring caravan in May of 1847. So some old friends leave there. And then sometimes that summer, William Bent's wife, Owl Woman, gives birth to their fourth child, a daughter named Julia. But unfortunately, she dies soon after from complications related to the childbirth. Then, that fall, George Bent, who by this time is also a partner in the business, he is at the fort and he collapses as he's mounting his horse. And they take him inside the fort to try and take care of him, and he's dead by the next day. And it's thought today he probably died of complications from malaria. So William Bent has lost he's lost two brothers and a wife in the course of 10 months. You lost someone you loved? Hard. Now imagine losing three. He's just had these big holes torn in his heart. So by the end of 1847, a lot of things are in question at Bent's Fort. The trade relationships have broken down. Two of the business partners have died. The remaining owner is in a state of grief. So it's the beginning of the end of Bent's Fort. In early 1848, so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed and the war ends. At Bent's Fort, the two remaining partners, William Bent and Sarah St. Vrain, form a partnership with just the two of them, and they start to liquidate their assets. They open a store in, back in Missouri where they're selling things at bargain prices. And the company that they've been marketing their buffalo robes to for many years, Pierre Chateau and Company, they owe a large amount of money to the Chateaus. And they end up having to go to court to settle that debt. At the same time, they have thousands of dollars of unpaid bills that the Army owes them because they were handling shipments of military freight for the Army throughout the war. Now the military doesn't want to pay the bill. So now there's financial problems on top of everything else. So by August of 1849, things finally come to an end at Bent's Fort. The winter of 48-49 is the last season where they do trading at the fort. And then that summer, there are some people traveling nearby, and they hear a large sound. And they see a column of smoke rising from the fort. And they go to investigate, and there's no one there. William Bent and Sir St. Vrain have left. William Bent had removed most of his goods from the fort a short time before, but there were still things of value that were there. They were damaged and destroyed in the fire. And so the fire remains a mystery to this day. Some of the things that you'll hear, some people speculate that it was native people, Indians, that attacked the fort and set it on fire. Because by this time, the relationships with the native peoples had also broken down. During the Mexican-American War, you've got more and more soldiers coming down the trail, and they're starting to encroach on the native people's homelands. There are outbreaks of cholera, which are devastating in the 1840s, so many people are dying. And so they're starting to lash out and fight back as best they know how. And there are attacks on the Santa Fe Trail by the Comanche, Kiowa, and Arapaho in the late 1840s that result in the death of over 40 Americans. So in late 1847, the U.S. Army, for the first time, sends out a force of volunteers from Missouri under the leadership of a man named Gilpin, and their mission is to fight back against the native people of the Southern Plains and stop the violence. This is the first time that the Army actually acts against the nations of the Great Plains. And of course, it just gets worse and worse from there. So when the fire happens, it's speculated maybe Indians did it. The relation with the Indian ship is broken down. Another thing that you'll hear is perhaps it was the grief. One of his family members in later years said he thought that his fire had set the fire because he was so sad and he was hurting so badly. And they had actually made attempts to sell the fort to the military because after the war they wanted to build forts along the Santa Fe Trail, and they thought maybe they want this one. But all the resources around the fort by that time were used up and stripped. So the grazing, the firewood, the meat hunting, the buffalo hunting, it was all gone. It was all consumed. At the end, they're having to go 5, 6, 7 miles to get these resources. So the military doesn't want the fort. But they say that perhaps William Bent lit the fire, even lit the powder magazine, and blew up his own fort so the Army couldn't come and get it without paying for it. The other story that I've heard that came from one of his granddaughters is that maybe it was fear of disease that caused him to burn the fort. Because one of his wives had an exposure to the cholera and was at the fort, and so maybe they burned the fort to try and stop the spread of the disease. But when it comes down to, we just don't know. But August 1849 was the end of the trading era at Bent's Fort, and after that the fort is abandoned through the 1850s. But then something happens. 1859, gold is discovered near Cherry Creek, and the Pikes Peak or Bust gold rush is on. And you get a wave of immigrants coming into Colorado, and the Colorado that we know today begins to be settled and take shape. So meanwhile, back to the fort, Bent's Fort gets a second life as a stagecoach stop in the 1860s and 70s. It's remodeled, and because the front part of it wasn't damaged by the fire, it was just the rear of the building. So it gets remodeled. Several different stage companies operated at different points. The U.S. mail is delivered through there. But then finally, in the 1870s, the railroad comes to the area, and the railroad ends up replacing the Santa Fe Trail. And that's the end of the era. Now, Bent's Fort changes hands a number of times over the years. The first time that anyone actually legally owns it is when William Beth's daughter Julia is given legal title to the land following the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. Because remember, he has a Cheyenne family, and they were caught up in that tragedy. And the government gave allotments of land to some of the people as a form of reconciliation. So Julia Bent was the first one to have legal title to the land where Bent's Fort was. But then she later sold it to some ranchers. It passed hands several times, and it ends up in the hands of a man named Albert E. Carlson. He was a trader himself at one time, knew the Bents. He made quite a bit of money, did very well for himself in mining in Colorado, and he ends up giving the property, or selling the property, I should say, to the Daughters of the American Revolution in the 1920s. He got the property about 1900. And the Daughters of the American Revolution actively worked to preserve the history there. In the 1950s, the Daughters of the American Revolution sell the site to the Colorado State Historical Society for $1 because they want to see its history preserved. And starting as far back as the 1950s, there's talk of rebuilding the fort. But the state of Colorado, unfortunately, didn't have the resources to do that. So in 1960, they got the National Park Service involved, and it became a National Historic Site that year. And archaeological work was done on the site by the state of Colorado and by the National Park Service. Extensive historical research was done, and they found some amazing first-hand resources. And then the reconstruction finally took place in 1975 and 76. So today you can go out and you can visit the reconstructed Bent's Fort. And all the history that happened there, it's such an incredible story because there's so many things that happened there that we don't think about. I think the Mexican-American War is pretty much a forgotten conflict for us today. For the people of Mexico, it has much more significance than it does for us. Oh yeah, manifest destiny, I think I heard something about that in 4th grade. But the events that the people lived through at Bent's Fort shaped the lives of not only the people of the American Southwest and the United States, but also of Mexico, and also the lives of the people of the Great Plains, the Southern Cheyenne, the Arapaho especially. Their lives were changed forever by the relationships that formed and then ended at Bent's Fort. So, now you know a little bit about it. I invite you again to come out, experience the history, visit the site. It's a unique and beautiful building, and there's so many stories, so many threads that you can follow when you explore it. So at this point, I'll wrap up and turn it over to you. Do you have any questions, comments, stories that you would like to share?
So it's not true that Bent blew up the fort.
We don't know. That's the legend that you hear, is that he lit the powder magazine and blew it up or set fire to it. The known historical fact is that someone came to the fort, smoke was billowing out, a large sound had been heard, nobody was there. So it's speculation. And you'll hear a lot that he blew up the fort, but it's not proven history.
Which one is more credible? The fire because of cholera?
Want me to add to that?
Do you have any comments? Betty has worked at the fort, so she's very knowledgeable too. What do you know about Betty?
George Bent's son, William Bent's son, George Bent, was just a little boy. I think he was probably about 10 years old. And William Bent loaded him in the wagon, and they went off some distance, and William had the family wait right there, and he went back to the fort, and there was a loud boom, and smoke rose in the air, and then William Bent came back. So that's where people get the idea that he blew up the fort. But, and then too, a lot of people imagine that the whole fort burned down, and it did not. The guess that we've guessed is that he had black powder in there, that he didn't want to fall into the wrong hands, and so that's why he blew up. So you can, so there's another story for you. How's that?
All right. Thank you, Betty. But, when they did archaeological work on the fort, they found evidence that it had been heavily damaged by fire. But it's an adobe structure, so you've got wooden posts and columns and roof beams and stuff like that would have burned. But the adobe doesn't burn; it's earth. So the front part was undamaged, and the back part, the wooden part was damaged. But the fort again had that second life as a stagecoach stop in the 60s and 70s.
When they rebuilt it, it only had the foundation then.
Yeah, when the Park Service did the reconstruction, right, all that was left was just the stubs of the walls. The last walls of the fort washed away in a flood in 1921. If any of you are familiar with it, the same flood that devastated Pueblo, Colorado, the Arkansas River and Fountain Creek both flooded at the same time, and those waterways come together in downtown Pueblo. So Pueblo suffered severe damage. It's unknown how many people died, but it's thought to be in the hundreds. And that wall of water came down the valley and took away the last major remains of Betts Fort. But there are people that remember playing out there as kids, and they talk about seeing stubs of the walls. And actually today, I met a visitor who told me a story which I thought was wonderful. He remembers being out there as a child and playing and finding beads in the anthills. And that's a trick that archaeologists use to look for clues, for a place to excavate where there might be antiquities. They'll look at the ant hills, the gopher hills, the prairie dog hills, where animals have been naturally bringing subterranean soils up to the surface, because sometimes they bring up artifacts. So he played out there as a child and found beads in the anthills. And that's one of the things they found was hundreds of beads and lots of broken stems of clay pipes. So, like these. Oh, great questions. What else are you guys curious about?
Isn't it true that there was a injured military person that actually made the blueprint of the fort?
Yes, you're thinking of Lieutenant James Hebert. So he came to Betts Fort with Stephen Watts Kearny and the Army of the West at the start of the Mexican-American War when they were on their way down to invade New Mexico. And he had a fever, so he got left behind at the fort to recover. And while he was there recovering, he did a measured floor plan drawing of the fort, he did watercolors, and he was a member of the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. So he was a professional military map maker. And he actually went on, he was a young man when he was at Betts Fort. He went on to do some incredible mapping and exploration work in the American West. He's actually an amazing man to learn about and not well known today, but very important. And so they have his watercolors and his floor plans on display at the fort in the room where he stayed. Yeah, great question. Right.
So how does the new Betts Fort fit into that picture?
Okay. The new Betts Fort, which is about 40 miles down the river, the other side of John Martin Reservoir, was built by William Bent in 1853. So 4 years after he left his first fort. And at that site, he had already had a log trading post, and that was a place where the Cheyenne people regularly camped. So it was a site that he knew and had been to many times. So he builds a new fort out of stone there in 1853. And he does business there for several years. Not as good as it was at the first fort, but he's still, supporting the Cheyenne people there. And in 1851 was the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now, in that treaty, the U.S. government gave the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho people the country from basically the foothills of the Rockies in Colorado to western Kansas, from the Arkansas River up to the Platte River. And they said, this is your home. This is your country. But then the Pikes Peak or Bust Gold Rush takes place in 1859. You get a wave of 100,000 immigrants coming out to Colorado, and they begin mining and building towns and farms, and it doesn't matter to them that this has already been given to the indigenous people by treaty, because they're not interested in that. They don't respect those rights. And so they're starting to say, hey, these people are in our way. This is a problem. Because for the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, they're starting to fight back. They've had their resources used up, they've been decimated by disease. Now there's a wave of people with no respect for their property rights. And so some of the younger men are forming groups known as the Dog Soldiers, and they're starting to attack wagon traffic. Excuse me. And this leads to what's called the Colorado War. Just a moment. So, in 1860, at Bent's New Fort, right next to it, the Army builds Fort Wise. And in 1861, we have the Treaty of Fort Wise. And the country that was given to the Cheyenne and Arapaho in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 51, they change it to this. They take away most of it, and they give them a little section, a fraction of what they had before. Basically goes from Bent's Fort over to Sand Creek. And at this point, some of the Cheyenne people are saying, there's nothing we can do, we can't fight about this, we have to try and keep the peace. There are other people, and the people are saying, no, we're going to fight back, we're going to resist. And there's a conference with Governor Evans called the Fort Weld Conference. I forget the exact year, early 1860s. I guess that would be early 1864. And the leaders that want peace meet with him. They actually ask for the meeting, and they go to him and they said, okay, we want peace. What do we need to do? And he says, this is now a military issue. I can't deal with you. Talk to the military. And the Army says, go down to Fort Wise, and we'll meet you there, and we'll figure this out. When they get down to Fort Wise, they're told, well, go out to Sand Creek, and you'll be safe there. Our argument is just with the people that are, committing active violence. So go to Sand Creek. You'll be safe there. You'll fly an American flag, fly a white flag, and you'll be fine. Well, and that's where the Sand Creek massacre happens. So they were attacked, and there were 750 people there, mostly elders, women, and children, and they were attacked, and over 230 people at least were killed. In one of the most horrible tragedies in the history of the West. So, but that's also a National Historic Site. If you haven't been out there, it's just past Eads, so I encourage you to go visit it. But so you're asking about Bent's New Fort. The Bent's family just ends up being in the middle of history again and again. They're like in the right place at the wrong time, the wrong place at the right time, however you want to think about it. But when the Sand Creek Massacre occurs, one of the sons, Robert Bent, is taken with the leader of the massacre, Shivington, to ride out to the encampment to make sure they know where they're going. And George Bent, Charlie Bent, Julia Bent are all there. They all survived, but they have many friends and extended family members who died that day. So if you go out to Bent's New Fort today, it's down a country road, an unpaved road, and there are historical markers, interpretive signs out there, so you can go out there and, there's just the remains of the foundations of the fort, just kind of a square of earth that you can see, and a little bit of rubble and some markers. But it's got an amazing history.
Is that the one east of Lamar? West of Lamar?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a little ways past Hasty and John Martin Reservoir.
But you have to get permission, don't you?
No, you can go out there.
It's like on County Road 19 or 22 or something.
Right, so you go out to the end of the road, and you can park on the side of the road and walk up to the top of the bluff and look down on the site where Fort Wise was, and you're at the site of Bent's New Fort there. But there is privately owned land there, and the site is actually privately owned. So you want to stay right where the historic markers are and not wander too far, because somebody's ranch is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, great questions. Anything else you're wondering about?
You didn't tell them where Rio Nueces is.
Oh, well, the Rio Grande is here, and Rio Nueces is the next waterway to the north. And that was where Mexico thought the border of Texas should be, whereas the United States thought Rio Grande should be the
What's the
border.
modern name of it?
It's still the Rio Nueces. The closest community there is Matamoros. So right on the Texas-Mexico border.
Well, I thought Mexico actually came up to the Arkansas, and that was the border.
Oh, okay. Well, this is over in southern Texas.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, I see your
Gotcha.
confusion. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I changed geography on you, and I didn't explain it well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So where we are here, the border between the United States and Mexico is the Arkansas River, but this was a boundary dispute over where the border of Texas should be after Texas became the 28th state.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is in the very bottom tip of southern Texas.
Yeah, because I hadn't even heard of that before, so.
Right. Yeah.
But
Thank you for
that's one thing about working at Bensport. There's always new stuff you're learning all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's so much that didn't even cover. So, if you enjoy learning history, there are so many, threads and spin-offs and colorful characters that, have to do with Bensport. And it's a fascinating place with many stories. All right. Well, thank you all very much for participating this evening.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you.
For the people of Southeast Colorado.
Adrian?
Yep, with
Yeah,
seconews.org from the Rocky Ford Museum for Bent's Old Fort National Historic Site. We're reminding you today is